We hope you enjoyed the panel entitled Due Diligence and Due Diligence, the Role of Entrepreneurship. For those that missed it, remember that you will find it on the platform for asynchronous viewing in the previous classes section. In today's incredibly interesting panel entitled In Defense of Victims and Survivors, we will be joined by Cynthia Belbusi, Jessica Choque, Eliana Palki, Santiago Inchausti, and Antonio Lucerna. This panel seeks to identify the duties related to the assistance and protection of survivors of human trafficking assumed by states and to promote good practices as well as to identify challenges. It will also examine effective access to justice for victims, including the right to reparation. It also seeks to give visibility to the reflection and experiences of one of the parties to one of the most emblematic cases in Argentina. To begin with, we will give the floor to Cynthia Belbusi, the project coordinator of the Human Rights Center and also a professor of human rights at the University of Palermo. She coordinated the first shelter. She has an MBA and a lawyer, and you can have access to her full bio on the platform. Cynthia, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you so much. I share my screen to make the most out of my time. So let's wait for a second. Let me know. Yeah, that's great. Just a second. There's something that I'd like to do. Throughout the course, we've been examining the several duties state have in connection with human trafficking from different angles. And now we're going to be focusing on the protection and assistance to victims and survivors. I'm gonna go over the different duties rather quickly so that after that we have sufficient time to look at two different action protocols developed by myself, one for a shelter and another for witness protection programs in human trafficking cases. So we have already seen that the key instrument when it comes to human trafficking is the protocol to prevent, repress, and sanction human trafficking, particularly that of women and children. However, there are also the principles and guidelines on human rights. And I don't know if you remember the presentation by Mercedes Azorati, where she dwelled into the difference between protocols, guidelines. This would be one of the non-binding instruments, but that somehow provides a framework for the application of binding instruments. So I have put together a summary of the provisions of both instruments when it comes to victim assistance. Our protocol in Article 6 establishes some of these duties, and the guidelines provide further information on those duties. So the first one is the protection of privacy and identity of human trafficking victims, providing for the confidentiality of all judicial proceedings. What does this mean? When we're working on any of these cases, that means, of course, not to disclose the personal data of the parties involved to the media, preserving their identity in all aspects, but that includes also the judicial proceedings themselves. For instance, if you need to transcribe an interview with the victims, what will you do? You will need to redact the personal details. You make a copy, the full statement with the names and any other personal detail that is identifiable will be crossed out, and then the original documents will be kept in a safe because they could lead to the identification of that person. Another one is to provide information to victims on judicial and administrative proceedings as well, available, and also their right to reparation. But, however, any advice and any information provided to a human trafficking victim or survivor needs to be provided in a language that they can understand. Lately, in Latin America, we've seen many cases of human trafficking cases, particularly international cases, involving Asian victims or victims that speak languages that are not the ones we usually speak in Latin America. And sometimes we don't even have interpreters for these languages that are so unfamiliar to us. The pandemic brought many negative things, but it also brought some advantages, such as this possibility of having online exchanges and probably securing these tools that were so hard to get hold of in the past. In terms of language, we shouldn't use any legalese to engage with the victims and survivors, and we should be able to do some active listening, informing a certain rights and duties. I need to double check all the time that the other person understands what I'm saying. And considering this, which is not a minor issue, particularly if we take into consideration that many female survivors um, have illiteracy challenges. So this may be a key consideration. Also, enforce measures seeking the physical, psychological, and social recovery of human trafficking victims. We're going to see this further along the presentation, so I'm not going to further elaborate on that right now. Having trouble switching slides, so just give me a second, please. Just 1 minute. There you go. So provide adequate accommodation. So, and the guidelines will further explain the meaning of adequate. What does adequate mean? What makes accommodation suitable or adequate as a shelter for a human trafficking victim? When we see the protocols, we are going to further analyze these issues, but these are the key terms that we need to take into consideration when working on these cases. Also, guarantee the physical security of victims, conduct a constant risk assessment because risks evolve. Risk assessment is not something that we can do once or that we can do as a single exercise. For instance, we need to see how the judicial case evolves, probably have a predetermined frequency, because sometimes to provide assistance to a human trafficking victim, there's going to be a judicial complaint required. And then provide different opportunities such as employment, education, and training. Education and training, I'd say, is one of the pillars for assistance because we should bear in mind that, generally speaking, human trafficking victims left their countries of origin in an attempt to have a better economic or social position. It's always for a job, whether there's deceit or not, but always attempting to improve their starting situation. So, for the state to provide employment, education, training, doing all the efforts that that entails, because there might even be foreign victims that don't have the necessary documentation in order to get enrolled in an academic institution. So we need to see how to help them register for a course so that they can actually have access to education. And finally, to adopt measures offering victims the possibility of obtaining compensation. I'm not going to talk about compensation and reparation in my presentation because Santiago Inchausti is going to be presenting later, and he will provide a much more interesting insight into this. When it comes to foreign victims, we mentioned the duty to adopt measures allowing for their temporary or permanent stay in the national territory, depending on the victim's will, of course. If the victim were to be repatriated, measures must be adopted in order to protect the security of that person in their country of origin. There needs to be a certain level of collaboration with their country of origin when it comes to a voluntary repatriation in an attempt to guarantee safe living conditions, to make sure that the victim is going to be free of danger if the victim returns to that place where they were initially captured. So we need to understand the power of the gangs, if there is organized crime involved, if they still have a full presence in that territory. And finally, of course, the issuance of the necessary travel documents by the states, regardless of whether the victim is a national or has a right to residence. I'm going to show you now how these duties have been effectively materialized in protocols. To begin with, what were the approaches that we handled when we were talking about human trafficking victims or survivors? There was generally a gender lens. There was a multicultural approach. There was a human rights approach. So now I would like to focus you on this approach. This does not mean that the other approaches that we've been applying, both the states and civil society, for so many years are not valuable, because they do add value. But this is a key approach, because if I'm working with a person and I effectively focus on their needs, on their priorities, on listening to their voice, that will be the best way to build this virtuous circle that we're presenting here. This has been taken from an ILO project that we did improve, but I think it's worth highlighting, because if we actually understand the needs, we avoid re-victimization, we guarantee constant care for those persons, and thus we guarantee access to justice, and so on and so forth. When I need to work for a shelter or for an assistance program, I always have 5 different objectives. I'm not going to look at everything that you see along the margins, which are different approaches that will allow me to attain these objectives, but I do want to highlight this. If our ultimate goal is empowerment, I will need to work on victims' roles, because there are many persons that went through this kind of situations that do not recognize themselves as victims. I will need to work on self-care. I will need to work after having attained these self-care needs. Will need to develop their autonomy, trying to make sure that these persons can recover their own voice. Sometimes their subjectivity has been completely erased. So this that may seem pretty simple may actually take some time depending on the person's context. we may be looking at 1 to 3 year plans. It's very tough work that takes quite a lot of time. And after I have achieved this autonomy, I can start working on a life project for that person. That person may start planning for their future.
This is sort of the rationale of a shelter. Our partners who are working in one will give you their approach. This is what we did when I developed this shelter. Is we took this approach. First, we focused on a comprehensive individual action plan that we called PAI for short, PAI. It consisted of different areas: healthcare, psychological care, that is also under healthcare, but more specific, legal support or counsel, and social work. If I'm addressing the healthcare issues, I might think that the person in front of me might have never seen a doctor before. Therefore, we need to develop a comprehensive healthcare workshop promoting self-protection. It's very important to go to the hospital or the healthcare center and to talk to the authorities to prevent institutional violence and to sort of smooth out everything to make it run smoothly or faster so that they don't have to wait for an appointment for 3 months. We need to talk to the residents beforehand. Then we need to accompany that person to this visit to the doctor, because you might have talked to the authority of a hospital. However, it might be the case that the physician talking to this patient might call out her name out loud in the passage, the corridor, or treats this person in a way that might appear to be biased. I mean, and sometimes these biases get in the way. When we are talking about trafficking for sexual exploitation, or when the victim is a migrant, there are biases that get in the way. I don't know whether you remember Yesenia's presentation when she said that what anguished her or distressed her was the discrimination she was subject to, from different people, even her neighbors. So this is a list that we need to take into account. Then psychological support or counsel. First, we need to think of alternative strategies within the shelter, to provide psychological support. I remember that one of the psychologists sat to watch the soap opera with one of the victims in order to create a bond. Therefore, for this person, talking to a psychologist, either female or male, was like, considering herself with mental problems, she had this bias against mental problems or disorders. And this strategy worked very well to, in this psychological space, address the topics that these persons may bring up as a need. You will not talk about human trafficking in the shelter because people want to address other topics, violence that they had been subjected before. Then we provide care and we try to accomplish the goals that we have in mind. But however, we always follow these dynamics. First, I organize a workshop on legal matters. Then I sort of bring in this topic into the person's agenda or interest. We organize different workshops or presentations. It's sort of a stepwise approach. We don't have to speed up or accelerate. We are within a shelter. And in fact, we need to repair, to reestablish rights, and we need to take a stepwise approach. We don't have to hurry up or either let the justice system hurry you. I mean, because sometimes they demand that you take the survivor to appear before justice, and we need to say, well, this person is not ready yet. We have to wait for the person's timing. I think that the key for us, because we were all women in this shelter, in any intervention, we thought, why are we pursuing, what for, and up to what extent? I mean, how far I would go? With a clear objective in mind. I will show you the difference with the protocol that I arranged for a program for the protection of victims and witnesses who have been victims of human trafficking. So first we need to perform a risk assessment. This does not mean that we should not be doing this in a shelter, but in a witness protection program, this is a key factor. I shall undertake a risk assessment. How can I do that? I mean, based on the documents that that person has given to me or with the case file. If I don't have enough information, I would not ask the person everything that he or she has experienced during the process. I ask specific questions. What was the recruitment like? Whether these people use weapons or not, the areas where they know that they operate, specific data that are not related to the terrible or despicable situation of violence and trafficking. Then I can make these decisions whether I monitor this person every so many hours, if he needs to be protected, if I have to go to a relocation. All these processes need to be addressed. I talk to this person, and after having this exchange, this discussion with this person, I understand whether this person has these needs or these intentions. We always need to focus on the needs of the human being that we have in front of us. And then we have to see how the system we have in place can tailor, accommodate to that person, and not the person to the system. I believe that this is one of the key issues. Well, I have run out of time. I will be leaving these PowerPoints with you so that you can see them in detail in the platform. And I'll turn back to Marisa so that we can continue talking. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Cynthia. Very interesting presentation. And I believe that many questions and comments will be raised by the audience. Now we will continue with this roundtable, and now we will give the floor to Jessica Choque and Eliana Palki Camacho. Jessica is a lawyer and a coordinator of the Ticarisunchis Residential Shelter that specializes in human trafficking, located in Peru, Cusco. Eliana is part of this institution. She's a psychologist and she holds a master's degree in public management and healthcare. She's also, both of them have 20 minutes to give this presentation. Good morning, thank you so much, and our greetings from Peru. As Maritza has said, I'm a coordinator of a shelter that provides care to victims of human trafficking in our country, Peru, in the city of Cusco. In the last few years, in fact, in 5 years now, from the first time that we provided care to one victim in 2019. This shelter has been created given the need of so many victims that were rescued throughout these years in our country. The organization of our residential center or shelter is based on some guidelines in place in Peru that provides for the organization of a technical team formed by social workers, physicians, nutritionists, and many other professionals. And I'm sorry, Jessica. Could you speak a little bit louder because you're quite low and there's some interference? Thank you. Can you hear me better? Yeah, it's much better. As I was telling you, our center is organized and is formed by a group of professionals and a support team. There are the tutors and also support staff that are the ones that provide security, do the cooking, cleaning. I'm talking about all these team because the work that we've been doing is extremely important. Not only is the work is based on the psychologist, on the social worker, or the nurse, address our victims. There are some other situations in which our support staff, the security staff, the kitchen staff are the ones that need to involved in get involved in providing care to our victims. Moreover, when they suffer from crisis or they have a outburst of tears, I mean, we all have, they burst into tears. And we all need to act in a quite solidaristic fashion. We take care of about 20 or 30 teenagers a year, no more than 15 simultaneously, because they require a very personalized attention. The work involves teamwork based on a comprehensive approach that has already been described by Cynthia, looking into the needs of the teenagers. All of them are protected by some remedy that has been granted by the Ministry of Women, but these protection measures or remedies or motions are sometimes the victims do not agree with these protection measures or safeguards. That's why when they join this shelter, sometimes they have to go through an adaptation process, and the whole staff needs to see to providing a space of trust and confidence among adolescents in order to be able to provide this comprehensive care and approach. We do have an cross-sector protocol and guidelines, and we know which are the institutions that can be engaged in this recovery process. And we also have an organizational work in place that has been developed by us, because during all these years we have served adolescents, both nationals and foreigners, and the victims sometimes don't come from a single Peruvian region, but come from different regions and also from different countries. We have served girls from Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia. Therefore, this multicultural care has been quite complex, and we had to develop different strategies in order to restore the rights of our fellow countrymen and also foreign adolescents. We follow a cross-sector protocol that decides which are the Peruvian institutions that have to get involved to reestablish the fundamental rights of these individuals that pertain to every human being. And then we also focus on on both national or Peruvian adolescents and foreigners, and we try to bring them back into their families. We engage the families actively, but there are certain situations in which there are no families or there's no support network, and that is when the staff of the center has to somehow take up these roles and create these bonds with the victims so that they can create the support networks they need. As regards the foreign adolescents, we resort to the most effective communication media so as to communicate them with their families, for example, through video calls or video conferencing on Meet platform. And we also encourage communication with the partner institutions in their own countries. What has worked very well in the work we've been doing is communication, interaction, be able to see their needs, to understand their motivations and expectations of each one of them, because these needs are not necessarily the same for all of them. And then once we learn their motivations, their needs, their opinions, we can use them to work with them. What we normally do is to engage the victims in all the recovery and reparation process and all the work for the recovery of their rights. They need to be informed and they need to know why they have been brought to this shelter, who we are. The fact that they know us and we provide a space of trust and be able to let them speak and hear their voice in all these aspects in which we are looking for justice. We try to make a connection with every institution, and this is done by us because sometimes the National Police and the prosecutor's office focus specifically on trying to find information to do justice. And sometimes they leave aside this human-based approach as to the way in which they need to work with the victim. So we need to intermediate in each one of the stages so as to avoid revictimization or inhumane treatment. When we mediate, when we act as the go-between, we provide information to the victim, and little by little they gain trust, and thus they can work for their recovery with the support of the psychological department and with the support of all the areas available in our sector. Sorry, Jessica, would you speak a little bit louder so that the interpreters can hear you better?
Should I go on? Then that service that we provide must also be rather flexible in terms of the working dynamics. Although we already have a well-established service subject to rules with a certain day-to-day schedule that we offer our adolescents and teenagers, this is going to be customized based on their needs, their motivations, and their plans. For instance, we've had certain cases with teenagers that had some sort of developmental challenges, so they couldn't adapt to the schedule of the setter, and our psychology had to prepare a differentiated, customized schedule for them. And this is how we do it. We try to adapt our service to the specific needs of every one of our teenagers. And this is what actually allows them to recover. Our success stories at the center can be measured based on the situation of every one of the teenagers. victims that have managed to complete their studies or to have access to post-secondary education does not necessarily mean that they were successful, because there were some teenagers that didn't want to go on living. They wanted to put an end to their life. And after our work, they've left the center with some plans, some work tools, something that has allowed them to appreciate life once again, and also to recover their ties to their families. So our success stories depend on the specific situation of every one of our victims. There is something else worth noting about our work, and that has to do with the center staff or personnel. Because if our personnel is not well, does not have the necessary breaks, and with good mental health conditions, it's almost impossible to carry out the work we do. In our experience, there has been quite high rotation of personnel because of the type of contracts that they had with the state. However, what has allowed us to retain most of our personnel has been the fact that the center has been able to focus on offering good working climate with spaces for integration. Also, our concern for their breaks and rest, because the mental health of caretakers is paramount. And this is something that is also managed by our psychology area, as Eliana will explain later on. But our center could never work if it weren't for certain strategic partners that we have besides the state. And I'm talking about private institutions or international organizations. Over the last few years, we've had strong support by the ILO, for example. They've provided seed capital for our teenagers, for instance, for their entrepreneurship efforts. And in our recovery work, we've adopted this approach of trying to provide financial education and encourage them to do business on their own, although we work on the rights of their victims, the recovery of their physical and mental health also requires giving them tools to prepare them for independent life, because many of our victims have come to this situation out of their poverty, out of the hardship and needs of their families. So the financial aspect is something that needs to be included every single time in their recovery roadmap, because we also need to change their mindset. We need to explain to them that regardless of the situation that they were in, because many of our victims are human trafficking victims for sexual exploitation to obtain quick financial gains, what we try to do is to change their mindset so that they can acquire working skills and obtain adequate financial resources, but with the support of their family as well. And the successes of every one of the cases is going to depend greatly on the support that they have when it comes to recover and when it comes to exiting the center. It must also be noted that, as Cynthia was saying, throughout this whole process, there is a fundamental issue, which is the victim-centered approach. This approach is going to record the needs of every one of our teenagers in a friendly manner, so that every step that we take with them, we can actually come to an agreement. We can talk to them. For instance, during the cohabitation at the center, there is fluent communication between teenagers. There are spaces where they can self-regulate with different meetings, and they can conduct their own evaluation of how they and they've lived day to day, their weeks, and they can actually share suggestions and recommendations that they share with my area with the coordination, and I share that with all other areas. And we can get to a consensus. It's very important to make them feel that they are heard throughout the process and that they are cared for and protected. It's the only thing that contributes throughout this extremely complex process because there are two very important objectives. One of them is the recovery of their mental health that often results from very serious situations. We've seen cases of self-injury or suicidal attempts. So supporting them throughout this process for the recovery of their mental health and thinking of their plans for the future, creating a business or preparing them for employment is pretty complex. And if they don't feel they are helped, they are not, if they don't feel they are heard, that would be absolutely impossible. That is why we as institutions or as an authority, we need to carry the voice of every one of our victims vis-a-vis the authorities. And over the last few years, this has allowed us to retain teenagers at these centers because most of our victims do not leave the center during treatment. We want them to go back to a normal life, but this is very hard at a shelter, particularly a human trafficking victim shelter. This is pretty close because of security considerations. And no victims are flowing in all the time. So we need to be extremely cautious with those victims that have been at the center for a while and the newcomers because we need to protect the safety and security of our newcomers because we are just getting to know their risks, the risks they face. And that is why every one of the cases needs to be evaluated independently. And that is why service is pretty flexible. But in my view, one of the most important things is something that our psychologist Eliana usually reinforces, which is kind treatment. Our Peruvian laws are always encouraging us to provide a familiar space. And this has been accomplished through teamwork, through articulate work among all areas, because in the end, if we need to work out a crisis or overcome a crisis, there's always duty on call. At certain cases, only the kitchen staff was there, and they were the ones that had to respond to a crisis. This has led our teenagers to gain trust in the work we do, and this has allowed them to recover. Goes without saying that not every one of our stories is a success story, but having over 50% of our teenagers return to their families, making sure that they could pursue further studies or gain technical labor skills is a huge success to us because we know of other prior cases where they had lost any appreciation for their own life, for their families, and there were no longer any ties among them. So we consider that to be a success story, as I was saying. And it's even more gratifying to know that they've been able to participate in certain fairs, take on a business activity, or pursue university studies. We always urge all the areas in our service, as well as the rest of the authorities, to look at the human side of the work that we do with our victims. Because, in my view, humanizing this whole procedure, thinking of them, trying to step into their own shoes, is the most important thing, and particularly carry their voice to our authorities. Thank you very much. And I'm going to give the floor to Eliana to speak a little bit to the approach we take at the center. Good morning. Can I go on? I think we have already exhausted our time. No, we are going to give you 5 minutes. Please go ahead. I am the psychologist. Okay, but we cannot see you. So, as I was saying, I am the center psychologist, and as Jessica said, our work is structured on different pillars. As Cynthia said, the victim-centered approach is paramount to us. They are the most important thing in our work, but there are also other pillars, such as the family, because without a family, our work is far more complex. As Jessica explained, another important pillar is the work that we do because we consider that someone that has a challenge cannot actually aid others. So we have psychological assistants as the staff because the work we do with our teenagers is pretty complex. And there's also the work that we do with the institutions related to our work. There's always this partnership, this exchange of information, because we need to provide consistent information to our teenagers. So, in order to avoid any inconsistencies, we would like to make sure that everyone is working towards the same goals. Teenagers are extremely important since they enter. Our main allies are the teenagers that are already at the center, at the shelter, and they are the ones that welcome the newcomers. We try to make everyone feel welcome and protected. We listen to their needs, and we also seek to restore their rights, particularly the right to health, because as victims of sexual exploitation, we have nurses, we have a doctor, and the first thing we do is to launch a series of medical tests. After that, we try to keep them busy and engaged in different activities. And for instance, game is paramount to us as well as art, because this has allowed our teenagers to get to know their skills and abilities. And based on those skills, we've been working with the ILO on entrepreneurship. They've been able to identify what they like best and to start their own business. And as entrepreneurs, they have strengthened their ties with their families that have helped them in selling their products. In terms of our psychological assistance, as Jessica was saying, every teenager has their own needs, and that is why we have differentiated schedule. We have patients with psychiatric diagnosis, and that has helped us getting them to become engaged in the center system. So I believe that this gives you a pretty good description of how we work at our shelter. Thank you so much, Eliana, for sticking to the time allotted to you. It's been extremely interesting to hear your views, your reflections, and your experiences. Thank you very much. Right now, we will listen to the dissertation of Santiago Inchausti. Santiago is a federal judge since 2009. He has heard cases of crimes against humanity, human trafficking, and international organized crime, among others. If you want, you can read his full bio on our platform. Santiago, please go ahead. You have 20 minutes. Thank you so much, Marisa. I would like to thank you for the invitation to continue educating myself and to share a little bit what we do at the judiciary, what we do in our criminal court, the work we do when it comes to seeking compensation and reparation for victims. I found it extremely interesting to hear Jessica and Eliana on the work they do. And now I would like to show you what we do during a criminal proceeding when it comes to provide redress and compensation to victims. And as previously shared, there is a very strong international framework when it comes to human rights, and particularly when it comes to human trafficking victims. The Palermo Protocol, the CEDAW, the Belém do Pará Convention, the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, the ILO Protocol of 2014, the Children's Convention. These are just some of the international treaties applicable to this matter. And pursuant to the commitments assumed by Argentina, Argentina has enacted several laws that seek to fight human trafficking, but also to provide the necessary redress, assistance, and support to victims. In 2008, we had our first act punishing human trafficking. In 2012, a second law was enacted where we stated the need to develop different measures to guarantee redress and compensation to victims. Another very important milestone is another accomplishment of the protest, which is the specialized prosecutor's office working on human trafficking and several other CSOs that have taken a leading role in this field. A law was enacted creating the trust fund for victims of human trafficking. That is a fund that was created with the purpose of providing compensation to victims in those cases where the criminal proceedings failed to obtain sufficient funding for their compensation. And finally, another very important piece of legislation is the one that sets out that all the assets seized in cases involving human trafficking crimes must actually be allocated to this trust fund for the redress of victims. So that be the legal framework that we can avail ourselves of when it comes to focus our investigations and our cases. That said, we will now analyze this duty on the part of the state to provide compensation to victims pursuant to Article 6 of the Palermo Protocol. Always bear in mind the case law and jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the Hacienda Brasil Verde case of 2016 that not only says that we need to punish human trafficking, but also compensate, protect, and assist victims through the adoption of efficient and effective measures. In my view, thanks to valuable interdisciplinary work among different agencies, prosecutors, judges, social assistants, and others that collaborate in support to victims, we've secured quite a significant number of convictions in human trafficking cases. But that does not mean that we were just as successful when it comes to the seizure of assets and provide redress to our victims. And this is our next objective, our next challenge, to secure more assets to be seized in order to guarantee better compensation for victims. When it comes to redress, what do we mean by that? This is something with a twofold purpose. On the one hand, the main purpose is to redress victims in the broadest possible sense. What does that mean? Providing reparation to restore the victim to the state prior to the crime or they were victims of, and of course compensate every single damage, physical, moral, health, financial. This is the purpose, and this is what we need to try to achieve in every one of our investigations.
Let's not forget that there is a punishing effect behind this. We want the criminals to pay for these compensations, and that aims at prevention. If we sanction the criminals, but we leave them with their assets and don't provide reparation to the victims, they would tend to commit the crimes again. That's why we have to deprive them of their assets. We have to deprive these criminal organizations of their assets and property. In Argentina, how can you obtain that compensation? Well, there have been exceptional cases in Argentina in which an empowered victim had filed for a civil claim or a labor complaint or action, but there have been very few cases that reparation or compensation in almost every case is achieved through criminal action. Why? Because this is always tied to the criminal investigation, the stage in which the complaint was made, investigation conducted, the victims rescued and identified, and therefore the state started to act providing care that is outside the proceeding. However, in the criminal proceeding, we need to continue moving forward in order to achieve conviction that would allow for the reparation or redress. Therefore, the field in which reparations or redress is done is in the criminal arena. Our criminal code provides for conviction, seizure, the repair, redress of the victim, and the compensation and the restoration of his or her victim assets. However, in the criminal field, the assets that had been seized in criminal cases would be used for victims' compensation or would become part of the victim's reparation fund. In case of money laundering, for example, and I will be talking about money laundering cases that derive from human trafficking cases. In this kind of cases, there are important mechanisms like this, the anticipated asset seizure, because sometimes you cannot find for the person responsible for human trafficking. However, you can seize assets for subsequent compensation. And that is a very important advance made in our improvement made to our laws. At the beginning, there were many convictions that did not pass reparation despite passing sentence, or they would say this is not the right field because the victim did not appear as a claimant or as a civil stakeholder. And luckily enough, this has been changed both in the justice or legal doctrine and by law, because the victim does not need to appear as a claimant in order to obtain a reparation or compensation, because the criminal code itself states that it is up to the judge to decide on the reestablishment of the prior status of the things and to provide for the reparation of the victims. In the light of international standards, this becomes an obligation to the states, and this is a res judicata, jurisprudence that has already been acted upon in Argentina. And we cannot await for the conviction to go after the assets or property of the criminals in order to seize, forfeit, and then compensate the victims. These are precautionary measures that should be taken at the beginning, and there is due diligence on behalf of judges and prosecutors to secure those assets, because if they disappear, we will end up having a compensation sentence or conviction, but we will be unable to foreclose them because there will be no assets. Of course, these assets and property would be secured in the in the compensation fund in case there are no assets available from that specific case. The Criminal Court of Appeals set forth that that is a right field that would provide for victims' reparation. This, together with the creation of the trust fund, has allowed us since 2009 to have convictions in place that come together with a victim's reparation. We still see that this does not occur in every case. This new stage always demands forfeiture and to set reparation that the amount shall be proportional to the damage caused to the victim. We need to use third parties or to resort to third parties' assets or property if they have acted in bad faith or there have been accomplices to the facts, and the proceed from the forfeited assets would be sent to this trust fund that would be used to compensate victims. In the past, these proceeds would be sent to some other areas in the state. However, there is a law that requires every asset that is forfeited from these cases to be used or to be stored in this trust fund that would be used for the reparation of victims. Just to give you an example, there was a case in Mar del Plata, a sect-related case. Though the plaintiff was there and represented by the official legal counsel that represented the victims of human trafficking, that is a very important tool that can be used in every system because they can stand up for the victims. In addition to the conviction, reparations were given, and the state fulfilled its obligation of providing psychological treatment. The assets and property were forfeited and used for victims' reparation. And it is impossible to, it's very important to remember that in addition to the civil compensation, if the victim was not part of that proceeding and then she notices that the compensation should be higher, she can resort to the civil law, in order to look for a higher compensation. It does not prevent the victim from resorting to a civil case. How is a compensation estimated? Where the judge, in addition to looking into the evidence, in case of lack of evidence, that might be the case, because in all these cases it's very difficult to set or to identify the physical material damage or the healthcare damage because time has gone by, the judge can set that. In addition to taking into consideration the facts, the severity of the damage, the judge may take into account some data that stem from the case. And I will share an example with you of victims of labor trafficking in agricultural area. In addition, leaving aside inflation, the difference from what the worker had to be paid from what he actually was paid. This worker got 9,000 pesos a month. That was very little. It was well below minimum wage, decent minimum wage. He was paid 9,000 pesos a month, and this should be added to the unhealthy living conditions. He got 9,000 pesos a month when he should have got 168,000 pesos a month. Note the difference from 9,000 pesos to 170,000 pesos a month. So that's the volume of compensation, and that's only from wages, and we have to add them moral damage, physical damage, and all the profit loss. Therefore, the traffickers make a lot of money, and a lot of money is being taken away from the human trafficking victims. If we think of sexual exploitation, we will see how much these traffickers make illegally and how little the victims get if they get any money. All this illegal gain is part of the reparation that shall be addressed or shall be given to the victim to compensate the damage and the illegal benefits that were taken from her exploitation. Sometimes we encounter problems because we cannot wait for a final conviction to repair. Sometimes the need to repair or redress is immediate, in addition to the support that we can provide to the victim outside the criminal proceeding. We need to know, as stated by international standards, that we need to be involved immediately, achieving some sort of urgent reparation, or, well, in my court or as the Inter-American Court states in Hacienda Brasil Verde, is to inspect the place. We need to do the search warrant and to inspect where the person is. I mean, I work in the Mar del Plata jurisdiction. There are many farms, and we went to one of them to rescue victims, and we detected that there were more than 150 victims, many families living in inhumane conditions without being paid, and they were exploited in the agricultural sector. Of course, the problem that occurred there is that there was no system of state welfare that could take care of those people. Therefore, we sort of intervened this company with the state, through the state power, and we mandated them to pay a legal salary. A month after that, workers were paid according to the collective bargaining agreements. We improved their living conditions, and that was a way of redressing the victims as the proceeding advanced. Then, of course, we focused on their health care, we improved the quality, water quality, we initiated the investigation of the equity of the owners of these farms. We noticed that they had property in other countries, and through international agreements, we were able to freeze luxury goods that they owned in other countries. These gave origin to the money laundering case, and if in the future there is a conviction, those assets that have already been frozen in addition to this farm, and of course this will be fined by the court, this could be part of the seizure and the reparation of the victims. Therefore, from the very beginning, we are thinking of the repairing the victims' rights, or restoring the victims' rights, and having the right assets to provide compensation. That is why it's so important that in addition to every measure taken during the proceeding, we have to think of the identification of assets, thinking of the future seizure and through the money laundering cases, and in that case we will be able to increase the assets and property for the reparation of the victims and for the trust fund of human trafficking victims. That is a fund that will have to take care of the compensation payment if there are not funds in a specific case, if not funds available in a specific case. This is an overview of the work that we do within a criminal investigation case. Once again, I would like to thank you for the invitation, and I am at your disposal for the Q&A. Thank you so much, Santiago. Very enlightening presentation, and there are already questions. Then we'll be asking the questions after Antonio's presentation. Antonio Lucerna will be talking now. Antonio is representing Maria de Los Angeles Foundation because Susana Tremarco, its president, could not make it. Susana is Marita Veron's mother, who was kidnapped and disappeared on April the 3rd, 2002 in the city of San Miguel de Tucumán. When looking for her daughter, she rescued hundreds of women and rendered visibility to the human trafficking crime fostering the enactment of the human trafficking law and assistance to its victims law that was Santiago made reference to. Antonio, you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is a pleasure to speak on behalf of Susana Trimarco, who's a guide for all of us dealing with human trafficking. I have the pleasure of working together with her in the cases in representing the plaintiff as plaintiff that we do in every case of human trafficking that we are involved with, moreover, in the Federal Court of Justice in the province of Tucumán, and remembering the hindrances and obstacles that victims have to access to justice. These obstacles have been the same for many years and are the same hindrances and obstacles I had to face Susana in the year 2002 when she started looking for Marita, when she started her fight, up until she was able to incept this institution, and she was able to provide support to all these victims that she had rescued throughout these years. And she was able to seek the redress of all these victims. We need to make reference to Marita Verón's case. It is unavoidable not to make reference to this case because we see that we are able to see the different ways that made quite difficult to the victims to obtain the reparation or to be able to restore these persons to the prior status before this crime affected them. Let's remember that Marita Verón's case, during the oral hearing, the case was heard by a provincial court, despite the fact that the human trafficking crime had became a federal crime in the year 2008. There was no human trafficking law at the time of the facts. Therefore, these people were tried for the illegitimate deprivation of freedom was the crime that they were judged against. The judges acquitted all the people indicted, that were 13 at that time, given the fact that they did not take into account the gender perspective. They did not take into account crucial evidence. And that's very important as regards the way in which the judicial agents operate, moreover the judges that will have to hear the cases and judge these human trafficking cases. They need to take into account that the victim is not an ordinary victim, is not the victim of a robbery, that in a prosecutor's office she can be called on the phone and ask her to relate the fact that of which she was a victim and conduct investigation. The work that has been done since Susana started with her investigation to find her daughter has been huge, and she has been able throughout the time to overcome different barriers. And oftentimes we see these barriers, or we find these barriers as regards the victims, and how this makes the effective access to justice more difficult and more difficult to redress. One of the barriers that I believe that with the amendments and implementation of the new federal criminal procedural code will bring more celerity to the cases, but no doubt the length of the criminal cases since the time the justice knows that there is a human trafficking case and a report has been made till the time the actors are prosecuted is quite long. We know that there are quite complex cases and it's not so easy to detect the responsible parties, but the length of the proceedings is an element to bear in mind as a main barrier. And I will give you an example.
We, as a foundation, were involved in case 10714 of 2014 in the province of Tucumán. In 2014, in light of this emerging investigation, we conducted a search at a brothel where victims were being exploited. This is located in San Miguel of Tucumán, for those of you that are familiar with that, next to the old bus terminal, because now there's a new bus station, and there were several such brothels located nearby. The search and the rescue of the victims took place in 2014. When did the oral trial take place? In 2021. Check that out. The time that went by between the search until the trial stage was finally conducted. What happened during those years? The head, the leader of the organization that committed this crime, called Hugo Diaz, passed away. So those victims did not have that inner feeling, I would say, that justice was made, because the person that had exploited them, that had breached every one of their rights, left this world without having been convicted of their crimes. That turns this idea of redress or access to justice illusory. And that is why we consider it to be of paramount importance to guarantee that these new federal proceedings can actually speed up these criminal proceedings, so that all the matters that arise throughout the proceedings may actually be concluded through multi-purpose hearings, such as the criminal proceeding in the province of Tucumán, which is quite agile, adversarial, where parties have access to this multi-purpose hearing that, in my view, is an excellent format. Often the lack of confidence in state institutions and the failure to respond immediately to victims' needs are usual in this kind of proceeding, because victims are always afraid. Victims are afraid of going to the precinct in their neighborhood, and they're afraid because they know that the police is sometimes an accomplice to these crimes, and there is some sort of collusion between the police, human traffickers, the centers of exploitation, and private parties. And this mistrust is something that we feel and sense every single day when people approach our foundation seeking advice or trying to find out how to make a complaint. We get often asked, can I file an anonymous complaint? Because I am afraid, because I've seen that at the place where these children are being exploited or these women are being exploited, there's police at the door and they know me. So if I file a complaint, I fear for my future, for my own security. So there is a lack of confidence on the part of our society. At least this is what we see when it comes to assisting victims and filing federal complaints. People do not have confidence in state institutions. They often ask themselves, why should I file a complaint if that would lead to no justice? And as for immediate responses to victims' needs, it's not only the judiciary that or the criminal courts to center on the prosecution of the crime, and particularly on applying sanctions, but everything we said earlier as well regarding the consideration of the extreme vulnerability of these victims and any progress made in terms of redress and particularly financial compensation to the victims should be much stronger and efficient. Let me share an example with you. Last month, in October, the Maria de Los Angeles Foundation secured a conviction for a man that was a police officer of Tucumán's police. He was convicted to 9 years imprisonment. And on the other computer, I have some details that the tribunal is saying to grant the redress requested by the prosecutor and convict Darío Mauricio Sandoval to pay 6.5 million pesos. That is the amount of damages assessed for redress to the victims, and it led to a seizure of the convicted assets. So this court decision actually provides for financial compensation. This financial compensation that is required under international and national laws. Now, when I refer to the lack of confidence in state institutions, we see that many victims make reference to the lack of training, the failure to adopt a gender lens. Law enforcement sometimes, not only those in charge of taking these complaints, but those involved in the searches and the administrative proceedings lack this gender perspective. We understand that a change is in progress and that training is being organized by law enforcement so that the agents that are directly involved in these actions ordered by the federal judiciary have the necessary skills to do their work. But in addition to that, this lack of a gender lens in these investigations sometimes leads to situations we've seen often, which is the re-victimization of the victim. Sometimes because of connected crimes, human trafficking victims that are to be rescued as part of the investigation are sometimes engaged in some associated crimes. And this is closely related to the fact that without the required context and the recognition of the victim as such in that human trafficking crime, that victim may actually be criminalized inappropriately because that victim is being enslaved, their decision-making freedom is actually erased by the authors of these crimes against them. So phrases such as, no, but this girl is working for them, they can go home, so they are not human trafficking victims. How can she be a human trafficking victim if she goes home to their kids every single night? With the necessary gender training, human trafficking training, and human rights training, we need to eradicate this mindset, both on the part of the judiciary and on the part of law enforcement that are key actors in these investigations. And in terms of the enforcement of judicial decisions, we need that to be far more effective. The procedures to execute these judicial decisions vary significantly depending on the context. The state does have a duty in this regard, but redress or financial compensation is not always sufficient for the authorities to execute these orders ex officio. Because it's great to secure a conviction in an oral trial, but we should also take into consideration that there's a whole path of enforcement of that judicial decision afterwards. And that is not the end of it. We need to walk the whole path in order to guarantee redress to the victims. And that also entails everything that has to do with victims' lives. I've been informed that I only have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to try to wrap up. It's also worth noting that every one of the areas involved, particularly on the NGOs such as our foundation, We are always seeking to enforce these commitments to a gender lens, this commitment to human rights, this commitment to fight human trafficking, so that the victim that is at the center of these crimes may actually be fully redressed for everything that they've been through. I would like to convey Susana's greetings. Susana is currently traveling from Tucumán to Córdoba to meet her granddaughter, Micaela, Marita's daughter, and that is why she couldn't make it here today. It's been a pleasure to hear every one of you, and I am here if you should have any questions or doubts. Thank you very much, Antonio. Your presentation has been extremely interesting. Thank you very much for allotting to the time. We've had many questions, so I'm gonna ask the presenters to open their cameras, and I'm gonna ask the questions that we've been receiving for every one of the speakers. Let's start with Cynthia. Cynthia, there are two questions for you. How did you manage to get the authorities to invest in specialized shelters when the data systems do not work and there's such important data lagoons or loopholes? Could you take a deeper dive into the awareness and training work that you do with health professionals? Thank you for your questions. Well, in response to the first question, that was not easy. Back then, I was working for an NGO that is called Zero Slavery, Esclavitud Cero, of Fundación El Otro, and we had just organized training for different government stakeholders, CSO, etc., explaining what human trafficking was, what were the needs for adequate accommodation, and so on and so forth. One of the teams attending that training realized that although they thought that they were actually working with the children and teenagers that had been trafficked for sexual exploitation, they identified that as a human trafficking case. It dawned on them and they understood that they need a different approach because what they've been doing so far did not work, was not producing good results. So we started a CSO, state collaborative effort, in that case, the city of Buenos Aires, that resulted in this initiative for the shelter, or this project for shelter that I was then fortunate to coordinate. But as I said, it was actually the collaboration between the state and CSO. And this is key because human trafficking actually disrupts the social mesh. So, in order to fight it, we need to create new networks, new forms of collaboration, and we need to strengthen them. And as for the second question, how we address health, yeah, the information awareness and training work carried out with health professionals. Well, I wear several hats, and back then I was wearing the state hat and the CSO hat at the same time. What we did was to tackle it from different angles. While I was wearing the CSO hat, I was training the authorities. I would create training with a theoretical and a practical module that ended up in a protocol for the identification of victims in hospitals and how to refer them safely so that they wouldn't be put in harm's way. And we need to develop tools because when you're working on human trafficking, the first barrier that you always come across is the ghost. There are different fears. What would happen to me if I get into this? There's a lot of fear of fear. So you need to eradicate that fear and to discuss openly and to show that what needs to be done is to work with networks and to put together effective protocols that are also safe. And that's it. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for your responses. We will now move on to a question that we have for Jessica. Some people in the audience have asked if there's a protocol to receive teenagers that have been captured, moved to another country, forced to have children, and they express their wish to go back to Peru. We have a multi-sector protocol that is applied throughout the national territory, and it establishes a distinction between the work with foreign victims and Peruvian victims. When it comes to foreign victims, of course, the regard is always going to be to secure repatriation because we want them to return to their cities of origin. So there are certain work guidelines. When it comes to minors, this is processed by a special protection unit that assumes temporary guardianship while the foreign victim is in Peru. And they issue a temporary shelter order for the victim to be referred to a shelter and also articulates with other authorities, in this case, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that acts as liaison with the different foreign embassies, and the embassies connect us with the children's protection agencies in their countries of origin. And they are the ones that conduct an evaluation of the family to determine whether they can actually protect the victim, whether they are in a safe area where the victim can be restored to. And so we get these reports from the country of origin through their embassies and through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and in turn, they get back to these children's protection units. So this is how we work pursuant to the protocols, as long as the victim consents to it, because there are victims that do not want to go back to their countries of origin, and that requires even further work because we need to do psychological assistance work. We need to provide counseling because that may actually result from the trafficking itself. And that is why the duration of these proceedings will depend on the wishes of the victim. If the victim wishes a prompt return, we will try to speed it up. But this is the protocol that we currently have in place in Peru. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica, for your response. I'm going to move on to Santiago right now. We have a couple of questions for him. And I'm going to move from the most abstract, the hardest, to the most specific. How do we do in order to estimate the psychological damage to the victims?
I am a criminal court justice. Therefore, I do not work mostly with moral damage, but according to what the Supreme Court establishes, moral damage is present in every case that there has been a physical, psychological damage or violence, like extreme violence, like being subject of human trafficking. It's not easy to quantify moral damage. It's up to the discretion of the judge as he measures or takes into account different parameters and the deprivation of freedom and so on and so forth. They will take into consideration the age of the victims, and it will be assessed in every concrete case. Hacienda Brasil Verde has something very interesting. I believe that it has set $30,000 as moral damage. You know that in the conviction, it says that there was no evidence on material and physical damage because that's obviously very difficult to assess in many cases, moreover with facts that occurred a long time ago. And the court set an amount in that case. I believe that that's we need to find the grounds of that conviction to use it as a guideline. I believe it was $30,000 per worker. Okay. Then there's another question that is related to topics that we have addressed in other classes of this course. Have you been involved in surrogacy cases and whether they also cover notary public's offices or law firms? No, I was not involved. I know that there is a new case in our country. I have seen it in different pieces of news, and I have seen this in the fiscales.org.ar page. I believe that the prosecutor's office against human trafficking is involved, that is led by Alejandra Mangano and Marcelo Colombo. And you can find that case there, that you might find information, but I was not involved in any case like that. And as connected to this, there's another question. Could you elaborate on the scope and competencies of the prosecutor's office? Well, I will describe this briefly. It's got two main areas to it. The investigation component, the one in which it leads different cases, that has jurisdiction in the whole country, and it cooperates with every federal prosecutor of our country that deal with human trafficking cases. As they have specific knowledge and specific training and capabilities, they are involved in that. On the other hand, in addition to this investigation component that they do very well, they are in charge of the criminal policies. They are the ones that write down the guidelines that we need to take into account at the time of investigation a human trafficking case, at the time of seizing assets, the destination of those assets, and then the resolutions signed by the prosecutor's office become mandatory for all prosecutors. Federal judges like me, investigation judges, first instance judges, ask advice to the PROTEX, the prosecutor's office, to define the steps or measures to take, and it's a prosecutor's office that works very well. They have achieved good results from the investigation cases and also criminal policies. They cooperated so that the administrative reforms that were necessary could be done. Thank you so much. There are two other questions, that is how the human trafficking cases have to do with the sentences connected to seizure of assets, and whether they are related to those cases in which a compensation was achieved for the victims. We also have quite new experience with money laundering. Before the human trafficking cases, we waited for the conviction to be issued, and then we started investigation. Now we have changed that model because of the TAFF. We have to start first with the report after a human trafficking case. After the report is made, we start investigating on money laundering, because there is where there will be more assets. You know that the assets are in Miami, are far away from where the fact occurred. Then we have to start investigating from the very beginning. And our criminal court of appeals, that is the most important court that we have before the Supreme Court, has ratified convictions of money laundering, and the precedent crime was human trafficking, though the human trafficking conviction has not been passed yet. And those assets that are forfeited in the money laundering case are sent to the trust fund. And as to anticipated asset forfeiture, in the case of money laundering, when the indicted person dies or escapes, or the statute of limitation is applied, if it is shown that the property, the house or the car, has an illicit origin that might be human trafficking or the other crime, anticipated forfeiture takes place. And otherwise, in the rest of the crimes, the whole criminal proceeding needs to take place. Yeah, I believe that everything is done, and if you want to point out where this information can be obtained, there is a page of projects that is within the National Prosecutor's Office. Web page has a lot of information about human trafficking. There are protocols to support the victims, but also to seize assets. And they work with other offices. The protocols are there. There are tables to estimate the compensation of the victims. It's very good, appropriate to use those protocols because they have come handy and they guarantee sort of being able to reach the right results in the investigations and in the redress of the victims. That is very important because this course applies to general audience, that people who are not in the world of law, and many of us. Therefore, it is interesting to provide us with tools, to provide them with tools so that they can be further aware. I don't know if you want to add something that you want to express. Otherwise, I would like to thank you for your participation in this session, and we will have a break up until 11:15, in which time in which we will be resuming our activities. Thank you so much for your presentations. They have been very enlightening, encouraging, and interesting for all those that have joined us. Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye. See you at 11:15. Thank you. I send my regards.
Dear participants, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on the time zone where you're joining from. My name is Andrea Andújar, and I will be moderating this panel of the International Human Rights course. Would like to remind you that translation services are available, so participants should find the language channel that best suits their preference. Speakers are kindly requested then, as we've been doing so far, to speak slowly so that translation is feasible. In addition, we would like to inform you that in order to ensure the accessibility of this International Human Rights course, we have the service of sign language interpreters. Throughout the broadcasting, the interpreters will be present in unison with the speakers, thus allowing all participants to have full access to the content presented. So we expect that you have enjoyed the panel entitled In Defense of Victims and Survivors. For those of you who missed it, remember that you can find it recorded on the platform for asynchronous viewing in the previous classes section. We will now present a dissertation entitled The Challenges of Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean in the Face of Human Trafficking. The purpose is to analyze the challenges that our regions face in eradicating the crime of human trafficking in all of its forms. What are the key actions and initiatives of civil society organizations involved in the defense of human rights? Are joint interventions by states a possible strategy to prevent and punish a phenomenon of transnational scope? These are some of the questions on which this panel will invite us to reflect. Presentation will be done by Rocío Urón Durán, who will kindly fill in for Candice Walsh that couldn't be here today. Rocío is the coordinator of the project against illicit trafficking of smuggling of migrants and human trafficking for the UNOCG, and you can have access to her full biography at the platform. Rocío, you've got the floor. Good morning to all participants. Before we start, I would like to present Candice's excuses, who's the representative of our agency for South America. Because of conflicting commitments, she could not be here today. So I expect that I will be able to step up to the challenge, probably not at Candice's level, but I'm going to give it my best try. I apologize, Rocío. Could you please speak a little bit louder in order to facilitate the interpreter's work? I'm going to use a mic. Is that better?
Todavía no, todavía no,
No,
pero
not really.
necesitaríamos si puedes subir un poquito tu tono.
So could you please speak a little bit louder?
Trataré pues de subirlo un poco más.
Okay, I'm going to try to speak a little bit louder.
Igual cualquier cosa me interrumpen.
And feel free to interrupt me at any time.
Bueno, como les decía, pues
As I was telling
la
you,
idea es presentar justamente
the
los
idea is
desafíos
to
que se
present
tienen
the
a
challenges
nivel mundial frente a la lucha contra la trata de personas.
worldwide again in the fight against human trafficking.
El tema es
And
importante ver cómo
just
las
to provide some
dinámicas de la trata de
context, it is
personas han
important to
venido
understand how human
cambiando
trafficking
no
dynamics
solamente en
have
Sudamérica
evolved,
o en
not only in
Centroamérica,
South
sino
America
también
or in
a
Central
nivel mundial.
America, but throughout the world.
Para empezar, pues quisiera
To
mencionar
begin
que a
with, I'd
partir de
like to
todo lo
note
que ocurrió
that
con la
since
pandemia,
the
lo que se ha
pandemic,
visto es una
we've
disminución
seen
en el
a
número de casos
fall
que se logran
in the
identificar
number
y
of cases
especialmente
identified.
se impacta lo que es el
with a special impact on Asia, Asia Pacific, North Africa, the Middle East, Central America, and South America. These are the places where the lowest number of victims have been identified since the pandemic and the aftermath of the COVID pandemic throughout the world. This has resulted in three different conditions where our challenges stem from. The first one is the institutional capacity in every one of these territories in order to identify the victims. Institutions have gotten stuck with their previous dynamics where victims were always found in brothels or on the streets, and there were only female victims for sexual exploitation. And this has resulted in ignoring other spaces where human trafficking victims may exist. For instance, in Asia, it's extremely common to find men victims of forced labor in the fishing industry. And the authorities do not seem to be aware of this. In South America, due to the different flows of migrants, we've seen quite a strong connection with forced labor, particularly in those places where there are mining operations and where there are illegal activities associated to drug trafficking. I apologize, Rocio. Could you please move closer to the mic? Is that better? Great. So then there is the change in the MO of traffickers. This was something that was not taken into consideration in the past. We always think that human traffickers continue to operate in the same manner. And nowadays, traffickers avail themselves of the new technologies, digital platforms, social media, not only to engage victims, but also to carry out exploitation, particularly in connection with sexual exploitation. And finally, we've seen a shift in the purposes for trafficking to more hidden spaces that are less detectable. That is, more private venues where the authorities find it hard to access and conduct the necessary operations. It is worth noting that sexual exploitation has decreased in the number of cases identified. That does not mean that victims are no longer being exploited for sexual purposes. All that it means is that there's been a change in the way these victims are being exploited and the places where they are being exploited. And now we have webcams, social media, digital platforms that are now being used to perform this kind of exploitation. To date, they are not on the authorities' radar, or else the authorities lack the necessary capabilities and tools to oversee these activities. This is particularly the case in South America, where we've seen a proliferation of the use of webcams and web-based prostitution. In Peru, Venezuela, and other countries, we've seen several situations of this kind. And in addition to that, we also need to focus on the different places where exploitation is taking place. Some years ago, in most cases, exploitation took place in closed venues such as brothels, clandestine brothels, bars, or other scenarios that were adequately mapped by the authorities. What we see today is that this has moved to private hidden places where the authorities have less possibilities of conducting the necessary actions. So we see, for instance, that in private apartments, we see exploitation. And in this regard, it is worth noting the involvement of the private sector, because hotels and apartments, such as the ones rented through online platforms and private households, are being used for exploitation purposes. In this way, the private sector can start working and can play a key role in the detection and identification of human trafficking cases. Worldwide, it is also worth noting that the cases of forced labor have also increased, and they grow line in line with sexual exploitation. It is the very first time that we've seen more cases of forced labor than sexual exploitation cases. This seems to indicate that there are different dynamics associated to migration flows, in particular, as we saw earlier, and it makes it easier to engage migrants, offering them money to pursue their migration routes and offer them work in illegal crops, illegal gold mining, deforestation, as we see in South America. And this has led to an increase, as we were saying, in forced labor cases. And it is important to identify these trends because there was a whole scaffolding and that worked very well for sexual exploitation. Authorities are far more equipped to identify sexual exploitation than forced labor cases. This has led to a need to develop new tools and to train the officers that work on case identification in order to equip them with the necessary skills to identify these cases of human trafficking for purposes other than sexual exploitation. Here, we've seen that there is a hybrid purpose that did not used to be seen in the past, and that had to do with sexually exploited people at night who are forced to do some sort of work during the day, and that can vary from domestic work, factory work, and they actually exploit them 24 hours a day in this manner. Another point worth noting refers to the increase identified in the number of adult male and male children victims, particularly for forced labor. From 2004 to 2020, there was a decrease in the number of women identified as human trafficking victims, while we've seen an increase in the number of girls and female teenagers identified as victims. We've seen an increase in the number of male, both adult and children. And now we would like to point your attention to the need to expand our approach to human trafficking, because sometimes there's this narrow-minded approach that considers that girls and women are the only victims to human trafficking. We need to change this, and that is closely related to the need for services to assist victims. In Asia, for instance, we've seen several situations where men that are victims of forced labor in the fishing industry return to their homes after having been exploited and cannot have access to any source of protection or assistance or the possibility of starting or filing a complaint in order to bring their cases to court. And this occurs because there is no institutional offering to assist male adults and children that have been victims of human trafficking. That is why certain authors in Asia refer to this as a feminization of human trafficking and refer to the challenge that this poses to those countries that have been building an institutional offer only around the sexual exploitation of women, but have no offer of services or very little when it comes to forced labor of men and male children. And this is a further limitation to restore the rights of these victims for the male population. It's also worth mentioning how victims throughout the world have been developing different processes to overcome their victim condition. And a red flag in this regard, particularly for South America and Africa, where most victims, that is 41% of the victims, are self-rescued. What do we mean by this? It means that it were the victims themselves that developed or carried out some sort of actions that allowed them to escape their control of their traffickers without any involvement on the part of the authorities or any other institutional presence. And that poses a whole burden of overcoming their exploitation on the victims themselves. And there is no search for victims. That is one of the main reasons the authorities, particularly in these two cases that we've mentioned, are just awaiting complaints and they wait for any tip before they will actively search for a victim. This makes it very hard to rescue the victims, and it's very hard for the victims themselves to manage to escape that situation of exploitation. Only 28% of victims in these places are rescued by police action. And that 28% actually refers to actions triggered by information provided by family members or some other information provided to the police, but there's no active investigation of cases. And this actually limits the possibilities of actively rescuing the victims.
They might start their escape with the support of the neighbors, of people who they don't know. I mean, those women that are in these places that are full might receive help to escape. I mean, they have received the help of the clients or an individual that has come close to her and realized what the situation was like. This is one of the challenges that are faced in the world in general to rescue women and to provide protection and care to the victims. Mention is made here about the fact that there are certain groups that are related to exploitation. I was talking about the classification made based on the information collected about the different characteristics of traffickers. I repeat, the individual trafficker, that is the person, a single person, who exploits his victim without making a lot of money, I mean, without raising much money. And in fact, the purpose of trafficking is obtaining economic benefits, like, for example, servitude. This might be the case of someone who takes to his home a young girl or young woman in remote areas or from indigenous communities. They take this girl home specifically to be part of, I mean, for servitude. There's no commercial exploitation. This person will not make a lot of money, but he benefits from exploiting this person. About 10% of traffickers in the world are individual traffickers, are much more difficult to identify because these cases happen at closed doors where the authorities are unable to draw much information, or the situation has become natural or normal. It's very common in some places, in some regions. Moreover, in the Andean region, in South America, or in Africa, to take girls from indigenous communities to the city and to lock them in their houses, to use them as domestic workers without any kind of pay or recognition. They are deprived of their autonomy and mobility. However, it's something that happens and it's quite normal and well regarded by many persons. Therefore, this becomes something natural, and as it happens at closed doors, it makes the detection of these kind of cases quite difficult. Then we have traffickers that can have a sort of the possibility of associating or partnering. For example, they participate in the recruitment or transportation of the victims. That is their involvement in trafficking. It's not their job. They will not become traffickers, but rather they see a chance of making money by developing some sort of activity related to trafficking. They are not directly involved. And then we have criminal organizations who have control over a certain territory. They work in other criminal activity like drug trafficking. These organizations that are located in neighborhoods or settlements or specific areas of the city where they control the drug dealing, and they can also control the brothel service or prostitution. Then they avail themselves from that territorial control in order to exploit persons either through forced labor or making them participate in illegal activities or sexual exploitation directly. And finally, what relates to organized crime, and these is quite significant in South America that has been has seen the increase of transnational criminal organizations who provide territorial control, and though they are not full-time traffickers, have found illegal trafficking or smuggling of individuals a way of increasing their illegal gains. We are talking about the participation of the Aragua train in South America that is being present in almost all the continents of the continent. We are talking about transnational criminal organizations that originate in Brazil but control areas in Paraguay and in Argentina as well. We are talking about organized crime in Colombia that is also present in Ecuador and Peru. Therefore, this organized crime accounts for 46% of human trafficking in the world. And we are also making reference to Asian organized crime, the Chinese mafia, Yakuza mafia, and how through their presence, they exploit 46% of all the victims in the world. We know that this is not their core business. However, they are present and they are significantly important in the conducting of this crime. We know that justice convictions or decisions state that organized criminal organizations sort of have the largest shares of convicted individuals. However, this does not affect the people who, also those tried are those that do the requirement, but not those that lead the criminal organizations. 92% of the convictions sentence the person who contacted the victim, that offered the job or offered the activity that that person was allegedly going to perform. Therefore, the impact of the convictions at a global level is minimum as compared to the seriousness of the problem affecting us, and is becoming very relevant among criminal organizations. To date, there has been no leader of any criminal organization who had been convicted due to human trafficking. Therefore, we see that those convictions or sentences are very weak in the face of the problem. On the other hand, individual traffickers operate with very few victims. Between 10 and 11% of the victims identified are exploited by individual traffickers. However, there is a strong presence in each one of the countries, moreover in internal trafficking, and they are very difficult to detect. That's why they make a significant impact, and they are outside the scope or the focus of authorities, and they might exploit in a much more easier way. That is why it is so important to guide the authorities to be able to identify the type of trafficker. When speaking of human trafficking, people think of transnational trafficking. They imagine those people crossing the border, traveling to a different country where they will be exploited. And in fact, they lose sight of individual traffickers and internal traffickers. Finally, and connected to criminal organizations, we need to see how they can use the force and they can be much more violent with the victims that they are affecting. Well, very quickly, we can see that most of the people convicted are men, while women account for 40% of the persons convicted in the world. Something important to mention is how climate change and political and economic crisis might be leading to situations that are connected to human trafficking, and we cannot lose sight of all this because climate change and the climate crisis is something that is affecting us all and might set the right stage for this problem with the victims. We have several challenges as to human trafficking. First, the use of new technologies. The authorities of the world are not prepared in order to investigate and try human trafficking cases that occur through the new technologies. Therefore, the authorities and the governments should enforce regulations and law that can make the investigation and the prosecution of cases through these platforms easier. On the other case, we have the feminization of human trafficking. We need to do away with gender-based stereotypes in order to be able to provide care and protection to men and boys that are subject to human trafficking for forced labor, for example. The involvement of the private sector is also very important with everything that has to do with the places where human trafficking is taking place, participation of hotel chains, accommodation platforms, because they can be used as places for exploitation. As I've said before, climate change needs to be taken into account as a situation that might increase the number of people that have been subject to traffic, because they might result in vulnerabilities that will affect significantly women and girls, given the displacement that may take place as a result of climate change. And finally, how illegal armed groups, local criminal gangs, and transnational organized crime see in human trafficking and that they might benefit from by using the control they have over territory, and how investigations and all these processes need to be encouraged in order to dismantle these rings or bands that are related to human exploitation in the places where they have their territorial coverage. Well, these are the 5 main items that we want to make reference to in the face of the challenges that we have to counter when struggling against human trafficking. Thank you so much, Rocio, for this presentation that has been so detailed, and to a great extent it encompasses all the topics and problems that we have tackled with or been able to talk about during this seminar. And you have very clearly set forth the main challenges that we face as a group, as a community, in the face of this problem that has been changing strategies and the possibility of being detected, moreover, after the pandemic. This process has changed and has worsened this flagrant violation against human rights. And I would like first to thank you for your presentation and to congratulate you on your presentation and on your analysis. And they are asking us whether you can dig deeper into one of the aspects, because people are still very interested, and this resonates with them. And what are the main challenges as to companies and trafficking? I mean, then if you want to answer, it would be fantastic. Well, the companies are sort of outside the list of those that can be traffickers. Therefore, that restricts the control and follow-up actions. However, it is important that the state can develop some sort of protocol or tool that would allow investigators who are working the labor offices to be able to perform a comprehensive control in companies. This is in very early stages in most of the countries. This has not been accomplished yet, but it is something that we need to do because, moreover, farms or companies in the agricultural sectors or textile companies make a significant impact on the victims that are exploited or subject to forced labor. Given the limitations that the labor inspectors have or the limitations of scope, many of these situations are being disregarded. Therefore, states shall be committed to generating these kind of tools, be able to train the inspectors, for example, involved in these jobs, so that they can detect human trafficking within the companies and therefore resort to the punishing processes, and they can take these cases to trials so that the victims can be redressed and the whole situation much more controlled. Thank you so much, Rocio, for your answer. And we would like to thank you once again for your generosity and for participating and replacing for Candace Welsh in this closing that has been very valuable. You have contributed with different topics to talk about, to reflect upon, and so that we can continue designing ways or deciding on ways to eradicate or counter this aberrant practice that violates human rights. We would like to thank you, and well, now you are free from your participation in the course. Well, thank you so much. A big hug.
Okay, let's go on now. Now for the closing of our course, we're gonna have an activity that we treasure especially, which is the presentation of the publication of the Third Regional Forum on Latin America Against Modern Slavery. For this, we will now have the words of our dear Cynthia Belbusi. Once again, thank you very much. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes, and after that, I'm going to give the floor to the director of Freedom Slaves Organization, Director Bukeni Warasi. And this publication is a great example of the work that we've been doing so far on the need to do more networking. The International Center for the Promotion of Human Rights, under the auspices of UNESCO, developed in 2022, organized a hybrid international conference for the redress to victims and for human trafficking victims. That was a great opportunity for us to start coordinating different activities with domestic and international organizations, many CSOs, particularly from Latin America. Thus, we started working with the organization I mentioned earlier, Free the Slaves, Caribe Afirmativo joined later, the Libera Foundation in Chile, Mondosi, United Justice, and Verite, that had some representatives yesterday in our labor exploitation panel. In this regard, we find it key to work like this, putting together new networks, strengthening existing networks. We created a working committee. We organized different fora, some of them smaller, some other a bit broader. And the publication we're about to present is a little bit the outcome of one of them. So without further ado, I would love to hear our colleague, the executive director of Free the Slaves, Bukeni. Bukeni, are you here with us?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. I can hear you.
The floor is yours then.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Cynthia. Very much appreciated the introduction. I first of all want to thank you, all of you, really, for the great work. I think this series of events started yesterday, and I was so pleased and honored to be part of it. And today, again, Cynthia has, has deployed me to come and join again today. So it's all joy here. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to meet many of you, even though it is online, but really meeting you, and also hearing everything that was presented from the previous speaker, I think was just wonderful. So thank you again for the invitation to join you today. So I think about the book, the transcription of the Third Latin America Regional Forum Against Modern Slavery on Human Rights Due Diligence really serves as a powerful resource, capturing expert insight and solutions to combat forced labor and human trafficking across Latin America. Throughout the forum, I think you remember, participants shared critical approaches that can help drive meaningful change. Some of the main solutions proposed included establishing a region-wide binding agreement, harmonized law, similar to the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, but tailored for Latin America. Due diligence mechanisms were highlighted as essential for gathering and sharing information on labor practices, integrating transparency effort with other legal tools to help prevent impunity. Now, what we also saw during that time at the forum, civil society involvement is also key, as NGO can take on roles such as monitoring, raising awareness, conducting independent research, or facilitating complaint mechanism, among others. Second, cooperation and coordination were also emphasized. The forum discussed working closely and expanding a multilateral cooperation between civil society, government actors, and businesses. Third, additionally, the forum focused on communities at risk and how they could effectively take advantage of the mechanism, such as migrant workers and indigenous peoples, along with advocating for survivor participation and inclusive leadership in anti-trafficking effort and due diligence mechanism. Aside from that, innovative tools like user-friendly databases and specialized audit were also showcased for better supply chain management. Now, to conclude, this transcription is an invaluable tool for anyone looking to understand and contribute to the eradication of forced labor and human trafficking, offered clear strategies for how government, civil society, and private sector can work together to make lasting progress and advance due diligence in human rights in Latin America. On your screen, you can now see the website for all Freedom from Slavery forums. They're available. Thanks to my team and especially my colleague, Jaime, who is, I'm sure, also watching us today. And of course, many other among them that attended the forum as partners and participants. In the Latin America section at the top, you'll find our publication where you can access the complete content of our event in written form. So I want to say again, really, thank you to all of you for for the great work you're doing almost every single day. The care, the commitment, and really try to always think of creative and innovative approaches to eradicate modern slavery. And the forum is a space that is available for you every time, anywhere, and really bring ideas, presentations, contributions, publications, and we'll be happy to provide a space for it, for the better, so that we can all together fight modern slavery. Thank you again, and I yield back to you, the moderator.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cynthia and Bukeni, for having presented this publication, which will undoubtedly constitute an invaluable contribution to the work carried out in the field that I'm sure everyone will consult to learn from it and to keep on reflecting based on this wonderful work. Now, with this top-notch closure, would like to say that we will now hear the Executive Director of the International Center for the Promotion of Human Rights under the auspices of UNESCO. But before that, before I give the floor to our dear Fernanda Gil Lozano, I would like to remind you that you need to access the certificate section in order to complete the multiple choice evaluation that will allow you to obtain the certificates for this course. And you can do it until the end of the month. Once you've completed that test, you will receive by email to the email address that you've shared the relevant certificate. So please check for it so that you can actually make sure that you've received the necessary certificate. And right now, we will give the floor to Fernanda Gil Lozano. Thank you very much, Andrea. I was here with a couple of technical issues, but I think everything's been worked out. So once again, we are nearing the end of another course. I would call it a beautiful course, but I know that discussing human trafficking is not beautiful at all. I come from a country where I remember that back in the year 2000 and even in the mid-1990s, when a very important researcher in Argentina, such as Sylvia Chester, warned that in the city of Buenos Aires, there were many young girls. And when she visited the places where these girls were allegedly serving coffee or working at weird discos, she would say there is a lot of mobility. And we started working on that notion of human trafficking once again. And for many years, when we discussed this, human trafficking was related to the transatlantic phenomenon that we had observed in the early 20th century, which is very well documented. But they felt that we feminists were exaggerating the situation in the year 2000. And I remember that in that case, the tragedy of Susana Trimarco with Marita Verón and a channel that had very high ratings, published or broadcasted back then a miniseries that was called Vidas Robadas, Stolen Lives. And it was with that momentum and on the basis of that narrative that was kind of a soap opera and that had been fictionalized, although it did follow the suffering of Susana Trimarco. It was based on that people became aware. After that, when I became a representative, we managed to issue a minority report for the human trafficking law that had some flaws in our view. After that, we managed to modify that law, and today that I see that we have an act that has worked, that has served its purpose pretty adequately, I would say. Of course, organized crime always requires to be up to date. And with this explosion of technology, networks, mass media, I wanted to bring this example of Vidas Robadas or Stolen Lives, but because I think it's a very good example of how a TV show may actually contribute to raise awareness regarding a topic that society traced back to the early 20th century as if it were a myth. And they felt that we were just overreacting, that we were exaggerating, that no such thing was going on. Right now, when social media plays a huge role in every aspect of our lives, now where AI is also characterizing whether it's algorithms. You say, I want to eat pizza, and you get like 10,000 ads for pizza on our phones, etc. I believe that they are very good tools and that we've been given a very important present, and that is the notion of networks. And I believe that civil society and government organizations have a moral and ethical duty to become even more entangled. Every one of us working to make sure that this crime, this transnational crime, is curbed, needs to get entangled, as I'm saying. In the same way that there are networks for everything, we need to work even closer. That is why I would like to thank Cynthia Belusi, of course, Barbie, Barbara Espíndola, who are like the visual faces of the International Center of the Promotion of Human Rights. But there are a lot of people behind them at the center working to make sure that we could actually have a course with the level required by UNESCO. And I would also like to highlight the work of our academic directors, Marisa Pinot and Andrea Andújar. With Pinot, I've shared, with Marisa Pinot, I've shared my whole life. We have a whole life before this, before these courses. And I'm proud to say that they have stayed with us, that they are constantly supporting, and that they are offering the high-level academic content that the issue requires, and everyone that has put up with the course. Because some years ago, when I started working on human trafficking, I understood that maybe people were dodging the issue because everyone understands that as a one-way avenue, like drugs. Once you become engaged with human trafficking, you never leave because you come to understand how much there is to do. You understand how you need to work against your odds and how deeply saddening some aspects of these crimes may be. And I often say that they leave scars in your soul, they leave traces. And that is why, for everyone that has attended this course, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you because at a time where we've moved from a bipolar world to a multipolar world, and these transitions usually come at a cost. These transitions always take us to the possibility of conflict. And it's going to be a time where we need to fight for peace. We have many conflicts coming our way. These transitions come at a cost, at a very high cost. And that is why there's a lot of despair, uncertainty worldwide. And maybe the most radical speeches reverberate, promising a certainty that they cannot provide, but somewhere in our mind, we believe that they will take us back, they will help us regain those values. No, the world is changing, and it's changing at a very fast pace. The market starts showing unseen signs. And if we cannot put a stop to these trends based on the optics of human rights, money will buy anything. And no one will challenge that. And in this regard, human trafficking, which is the worst possible crime against humankind, turning humans into objects. If you have two kidneys and you're a poor person, why shouldn't you have the freedom to sell one? Just like that. If you are wealthy and you want a kid, and you may not bear a child of your own for whatever reasons, if you have the money and there's another woman that can actually bear that child for you, why not? And so on and so forth. There are 1,000 examples I could cite. I'm not against science. I'm not against freedom. I am just challenging whether we are moving towards a world where money will suffice to do anything you want with everything that means. Therefore, organizing this course, funding this course, they were putting up with the course because they were extremely painful situations, gender, the world economy, international tools that we need to familiar with, but we also need to work with those tools all the time in order to improve them. That is why I would like to thank you. I would like to thank everyone that took this course because this content is very sensitive and they are constantly challenging us in our daily work.
This is what I wanted to tell you and to continue thanking you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So we'll be waiting for you in the next course next year with a different topic. Thank you so much.